In the stone-and-throne towns of medieval Europe, the value of human life was far from what we understand today. Law and justice were often shaped by the powerful, and an ordinary peasant or small merchant could face death over a mere accusation or misunderstanding. The punishments of this era were designed not only to penalize wrongdoing, but also to instill fear and obedience in the public. People would watch torture and executions, arranged almost as moral lessons, and through screams and suffering, they absorbed a grim form of societal education. In these dark times, a man whose name rarely appears in history and his young son was subjected to one of society's most terrifying punishments, being boiled alive. Their story is not merely about a punishment, it reflects the cruelest facets of human nature, the lust for power, and the harshest interpretations of justice. The man might have been an ordinary individual, perhaps a peasant, a small craftsman, or an inconsequential nobleman in a provincial town. What made him noteworthy was not the crime he committed, real or alleged, but the horror he endured and the fact that his son shared it. Accusations in those days were often baseless or cloaked in political motives. Perhaps he had argued with a local authority, uttered an ill-considered word, or inadvertently become part of a chain of rumors. Ultimately, fate dealt a merciless hand, sending their lives down an irreversible path. On the day of the execution, the town square was packed. The crowd, drawn by both curiosity and fear, surrounded the scene. Women, children, and the elderly, each face told a different story. Some watched with fascination, others trembled in anxiety, and some sought a perverse satisfaction in another's suffering. The boy may not have fully understood what was happening, but he tried to grasp the faint sense of security in being with his father. The father, torn between helplessness and fear, writhed with guilt for being unable to protect his child. The cauldron for boiling was large, made of thick iron. Water was gradually heated over a fire, and as it approached boiling, a terrifying steam rose. Before witnessing the punishment, the crowd would scrutinize the cauldron, attempting to imagine the suffering that awaited. Boiling was not solely about physical pain. The psychological torment, the screams, the fearful glances, the sense of hopelessness was integral to the punishment. When the man and his son were brought to the cauldron, time seemed to slow. Every step, every breath was enveloped in a heavy silence. The father grasped his son's small hands tightly, perhaps for the last time, perhaps seeking a fragile comfort in despair. This execution, performed as a lesson in front of the public, made their final moments even more horrifying. As the water slowly boiled, the father's and son's screams filled the square, echoing not only agony, but the loss of humanity itself. Among the spectators, emotions varied. Some trembled in terror, while others watched with a fearful excitement. This gruesome scene revealed the medieval conception of justice, the harsh face of authority, and the darker sides of human nature. The father, even in his last moments, struggled with guilt for failing to protect his child, while the son tried to hold on to the faint sense of safety beside his father. Yet the world swallowed their cries in a chilling silence. This event was not just an individual tragedy, it was a testament to the merciless structure of medieval society, a social order governed by fear and the extremes of human psychology. History recorded this horrifying moment, leaving behind a picture both terrifying and thought-provoking. The silent scream of a child, boiled alongside his father, still echoes centuries later, a haunting reminder of humanity's darkest tendencies. The cobblestone streets and town squares of medieval Europe, from a modern perspective, reflected a world both alien and terrifying. Human life was often at the mercy of the whims of those in power, Legal systems were far from fair or impartial as we understand them today. Instead, they were used to reinforce fear and obedience within society. The public, while watching the punishment of criminals, experienced both dread and a reminder of their own position in the social hierarchy. Torture and death were not merely individual punishments. They were orchestrated spectacles designed to maintain social discipline and demonstrate the authority of those in power. In such a time, a man whose name rarely appears in history, along with his young son, became the center of an unforgettable tragedy. They were subjected to one of the most horrifying and merciless punishments in the eyes of society: being boiled alive. Their story is not merely a narrative of personal suffering. It exposes the darker sides of human nature, the lust for power, concepts of justice, and the psychology of society. The man's identity was largely unknown. Perhaps he was an ordinary peasant, a small craftsman, or a minor noble of little influence in a provincial town. What made him notable was not his deeds, real or imagined, but the horrific punishment he endured, and the fact that his son had to share it with him. Accusations in those days were often fueled by rumors, misunderstandings, or political motives. Whatever had led to this man's fate was likely part of such a chain. Perhaps he had argued with authorities, spoken ill-considered words, or inadvertently made an enemy of a powerful person. Ultimately, fate dealt a merciless hand, sending their lives down an irreversible path. On the day of the execution, the town square was packed. People surrounded the scene, drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear. Women, the elderly, children, and prominent townspeople had gathered as witnesses to the punishment. Each face displayed a different expression. Some watched with fascination, some trembled in horror, and some sought a perverse satisfaction in another's suffering. The boy, unable to fully grasp what was happening, tried to feel a sense of security from being with his father. The father, torn between helplessness, fear, and the guilt of being unable to protect his child, writhed inwardly. The cauldron prepared for boiling was large, made of thick iron, and filled with water. Heated over a fire, the water slowly approached its boiling point. Steam rose, dampening the faces of everyone in the square. Boiling was not only about inflicting physical pain, it also included psychological torment. Screams, gazes, and the reactions of the crowd intensified the suffering. This was both a public spectacle and a lesson, a method of instilling fear. When the man and his son were brought to the cauldron, time seemed to freeze. The father held his son's hands tightly, perhaps for the last time, perhaps seeking a small comfort in despair. The silent anticipation of the crowd heightened the tension in the square. The water had reached a full boil, and its steam filled the air. Executioners carefully positioned the father and son, and the boiling began. The agony started at the skin, spreading to flesh and bone. Pain, fear, and helplessness contorted the father's face, while the boy's eyes reflected both terror and a desperate search for reassurance. Each scream elicited different reactions from the crowd. Some trembled in horror, others covered their faces, and some watched, transfixed. The scene exposed the society's sense of justice, the brutal face of authority, and the darker aspects of human nature. For hours, the screams of father and son echoed off the stone walls, leaving a profound mark on those watching. The spectators, simultaneously terrified and convinced that justice had been served, were reminded of the balance between power and fear. The child's cries, shared with his father, became an indelible tragedy etched into memory through the centuries. This harrowing event was more than a punishment. It revealed the psychological framework of medieval society, showing how authority used fear as a tool of control and testing the limits of human endurance. The father, holding his son until his last breath, bore the guilt of failing to protect him, while the boy clung to the faint security of being with his father. Yet the world swallowed their cries. leaving only silence. When the execution ended, the square fell silent. Father and son were no longer alive. Their screams and suffering remained a haunting tragedy through history. Some in the crowd wept in horror. Others attempted to extract a lesson from what they witnessed. This event was not only about individual suffering, it sent a message about society itself. Power, authority, and fear formed the backbone of medieval order. Thus, a man whose name rarely appears in the history books, along with his innocent son, became a symbol of humanity's darkest aspects, even centuries later. Their lost lives and final desperate screams left an indelible mark not only on the past, but on the collective memory of humanity. After the event ended, the silence that fell over the square was thick with both fear and shock. People were only beginning to grasp the reality of what had happened, unsure of how to process what their eyes had witnessed. The screams of the child, boiled alive alongside his father, still echoed in their ears, reverberating off the stone walls and leaving a deep chill in everyone present. This tragedy did not remain merely an individual sorrow. It left a profound impact on the collective psyche of the community. In medieval society, the understanding of justice was vastly different from today's standards. The relationship between crime and punishment was often less about objective assessment and more about instilling fear and demonstrating the authority of those in power. The man and his young son, boiled alive, were not only punished, they became living symbols of caution in the eyes of the public. Such executions were intended to deter others from following similar paths, suppressing disobedience and rebellion. The reactions of the crowd were complex. On one hand, there was horror and grief. The unimaginable suffering of father and son provoked both empathy and terror. On the other hand, some sought to extract a lesson from the ordeal, finding a grim reassurance in the display of power and the perceived administration of justice. Executions carried out in front of children instilled fear and reinforced conformity to social norms. Not only the ordinary townspeople, but also local officials and prominent citizens watched closely. For them, this execution served as a vivid demonstration of how justice was administered and authority enforced. Officials, carrying out the punishment, recognized the importance of their roles, the influence they wielded, and the power of maintaining order through fear. Such public spectacles conveyed the inviolability of authority and clearly signaled the cost of any rebellion or defiance. The cultural and psychological dimensions of the event were equally significant. In medieval society, death and torture were seen as integral parts of life. The public, while observing such executions, simultaneously learned a lesson and confronted the helplessness of human beings in the face of power. The man and his son, boiled alive, became enduring symbols of fear and tragedy within the collective memory of the town. Their story was recounted for years as both a warning and a moral lesson. From a political perspective, these punishments were tools for enforcing discipline. Those in power displayed executions publicly to consolidate their position and suppress opposition. The man and his son, beyond paying the price for an alleged crime, became instruments demonstrating the reach of authority and the effect of fear on society. Historians note that such events were deliberately used to maintain social order, functioning as a strategy of governance through terror. Over time, this tragedy became legend within the town. The story of the father and son boiled alive was passed down through generations. Their helplessness reminded people of human vulnerability in the face of power, evoking both fear and empathy within the social conscience. This event stood as a lesson, revealing not only the grim realities of the past, but also the darker sides of human history. Thus, the father and his son did more than suffer. They left an indelible mark on the collective memory of society. Their tragedy carried forward the brutal face of history, the harsh and terrifying nature of authority, and the boundaries of justice and humanity. The small child, spending his final moments beside his father, became a symbol of innocence and helplessness, and even centuries later, we can almost hear their silent cries echoing through time. The water in the cauldron had now reached its boiling point, and its temperature rose with every passing second. The father, holding his son in his arms, was overwhelmed with tears. Helplessness and fear burned together in his chest. The small child clung to the last sense of safety provided by his father's presence, yet his body trembled with both terror and pain. The moment was unbearable, physically and psychologically, enveloping them in profound helplessness and intense fear. The executioners carried out every detail meticulously as they prepared the cauldron and placed the victims inside. Upon first contact, the boiling water seared the skin, spreading its agony to flesh and bone. The father, hearing his son's screams, felt each pang of suffering as his own, sinking deeper into guilt with every passing second. The boy, unable to fully comprehend the intensity of the pain, sought the final comfort of being near his father. His eyes reflected both terror and trust. The crowd watched the horrific scene in silence. Some covered their eyes with their hands, others shivered in horror. Yet some seemed transfixed, sensing the terrifying power of the spectacle and the authority behind it. The screams echoed off the stone walls, amplifying the terror and leaving a lasting impression, a mixture of horror and warning on all who were present. The boiling process was agonizingly slow. The water grew hotter by the moment, and the pain intensified relentlessly. The father held his son's hands tightly, gazing at him one final time and silently apologizing. The boy tried to draw on the last reassurance of his father's presence, struggling to hold back tears. This moment revealed the darkest and most vulnerable aspects of the human spirit. Helplessness, fear, guilt, and love intertwined. Onlookers perceived the scene both as a warning and a source of fear. In medieval society, death and torture were seen as natural parts of life. While watching such executions, people experienced both terror and a grim reminder of authority's power. The suffering endured by the father and son was not merely personal, it served as a societal lesson. Those in power maintained order through fear, ensuring obedience and social control. After hours of torture, the father and son perished. Silence descended over the square. Only the steam rising from the cauldron and the deep breaths of the spectators filled the air. The screams of father and child had ceased, yet the impact of their suffering lingered in the minds and hearts of those who witnessed it. The event became more than an individual tragedy. It left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the town. Over time, this tragedy became legend. The story of the man and his son, boiled alive, was passed down through generations. People reflected on the event, contemplating both the power of authority and human helplessness. The agony they endured evoked both fear and empathy within the social conscience. This episode revealed the ruthless justice of medieval society, the relationship between power and fear, and the darker aspects of human nature. The boy, killed alongside his father, became a symbol of innocence, vulnerability, and humanity's most fragile qualities. And even centuries later, we can still hear their silent cries, recalling the darkest corners of human history. Even days, weeks, and months after the event, the townspeople continued to talk about the man and his young son who had been boiled alive. Though their screams were no longer audible in the square, the traces of trauma lingered in the very air. As people walked through the streets or gazed from their windows, they recalled that dreadful day, reliving the pain and horror. The cries of the child and his father became a cautionary tale, passed down from generation to generation, securing an indelible place in the town's collective memory. In medieval society, the concept of justice extended beyond the simple relationship between crime and punishment. It was deeply tied to power, obedience, and the maintenance of social order. This execution sent a clear message to the rest of the community. Those who defied authority or broke the rules could meet a horrifying and irreversible end. As townspeople observed the event, they reassessed their own behavior and boundaries, with fear leaving a lasting mark as a tool of discipline. The psychology of the populace was noticeably affected. Children and young people grew up hearing stories of the father and son, internalizing the event as both a source of fear and a moral lesson. Adults, meanwhile, experienced a complex mix of grief and empathy. The tragedy was seen not only as a cautionary tale, but also as a means of understanding the limits of power and authority. For town officials and prominent citizens, the execution was more than individual punishment. It was a political statement. Those in power used such events to reinforce their authority, ensuring order through a combination of fear and obedience. The ordeal of the man and his son became a lasting symbol in the collective memory, reminding the community of the reach of power and the uncompromising face of justice. From a cultural perspective, this tragedy shaped the way medieval townspeople perceived life, death, and suffering. Death and torture were considered natural parts of existence. The public, while witnessing executions, both feared and learned about societal norms and limits. The man and his son functioned as living lessons in morality and law, illustrating the harsh face of justice, the cruelty of authority, and the helplessness of the individual. Historians note that such events left deep marks on social memory, with fear and tragedy shaping collective behavior and cultural understanding for years. The father and son were not merely victims of a single day. They became enduring symbols of the psychological structure of medieval society, the dynamics of power, and the concept of justice. Their story persisted as a cautionary tale, passed down through generations, ensuring that the harsh face of authority and justice would not be forgotten. Thus, the suffering of a father and child became immortalized in the collective memory of the town and even the region. Their horrific end stood as both a mirror of individual tragedy and the dark psychology of society. The young boy, spending his final moments beside his father, became a symbol of innocence, helplessness, and the most fragile aspects of humanity. Centuries later, history remembers this tragedy, reminding us of the darkest sides of human nature.